All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming to tonight's discussion. My name is Jeff Metro, and I'm the Program Manager for the Humanities here at UC Berkeley Extension. Tonight, our panelists, Katya Singel and Chio Sando, will give a short presentation. Afterwards, our moderator, Robert McNally, will ask them a few questions to get the conversation going. We will be taking your questions throughout, so if you have any, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer as many of your questions as we can at the end of the conversation. If you have any technical issues, please enter them in the chat and we will do our best to assist you. This event is also being recorded for future viewing. Lastly, 3 lucky members of those in attendance tonight will be randomly selected to receive a copy of one of our panelists' books. So keep an eye out for an email from me in the coming days. And that's all I have. So with that out of the way, I'll turn it over to Katya.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I am going to actually start off the talk with showing you some slides as I talk. So thank you everyone for coming tonight and being here virtually. I'm with 2 close colleagues of mine, Robert McNally and Chio Sando, both of which I've been on panels before. Unfortunately, the one I was on with Robert, I got food poisoning and had to run off. So we're hoping that's not going to happen. Virtual is a little easier. The one with Sean went much better. It was virtual and no bad food that time. So, and today we're going to be talking about refugee story and really looking at not just, most recently we've heard about refugees in Afghanistan, but we kind of hear one section of that story, but really I wanted to look at the beginning, the middle, and the end. So not looking at just where it starts, but then resettlement as well, and where things progress through there. And so it started, the idea for this came a bit earlier this year, and it really started with the story with refugees from Afghanistan, which is kind of just beginning as we're looking at that. Of course, there were refugees from Afghanistan earlier, but more large scale now we're looking at what's going on there and hearing those stories. And there's actually an earlier Asian refugee story that resulted from US conflict abroad, probably many, but one we're going to look at today. And that story continues today with deportations made possible by the same laws that actually enabled the deportation of Korean adoptees, which was featured in a recent film, Blue Bayou, that just came out this month. So that was the reason when Jeff and I first started thinking of putting this talk together were some of these recent news events, and we wanted to kind of explore and look at some of this. So that's the story we are here to tell today. And I want to start with Cambodia. So, well, actually start with war. That's often where refugee situations, not always, but a lot of times they start with. So war in this case, and we're looking at Cambodia. It's called the secret bombing of Cambodia because until a couple years ago, the US did not admit how extensive the bombing in Cambodia was. This was during what we call the war in Vietnam, but really more aptly should be called war in Southeast Asia because it extended to Laos, Cambodia. And as you can see, the red here is where all the bombs were in Cambodia. US during this time, 4-year campaign, and it took up much of the country. So you've got a country that has suffered under war, and then you get soon after that, in that midst, it leaves kind of a vacuum. Obviously other things in play as well. This is a short version, but trying to show kind of connections between US involvement and what came after. So then we did have the genocide, the brutal regime that ruled from 1975 to 1979. The Khmer Rouge are responsible for one of the worst killings of the 20th century. And during the tail end of the last century, 158,000 Cambodians came to the United States, mainly as refugees, most of them after the fall of the Khmer Rouge in 1979. Chio Sando is one of them, and he recounts his story starting there in Cambodia. Actually, he starts in a beautiful time in Cambodia before the killing fields, but he recounts his story in his memoir, A Cloak of Good Fortune, which actually was featured on Snap Judgment, which is a radio program that airs on over 400 NPR radio stations around the nation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for having me here today. Let me start with my script. Life was beautiful in my childhood village, We play and run around freely. During our New Year's celebration, grown-ups and children sat on the sidewalks in the evening by candlelight, playing traditional betting games. I saw people laughing loudly, cheering and patting each other on the back. Street vendors busily wave their hands and call out, "Try my delicious fish noodle soup." Each store offers something unique: pan-fried noodles with crushed peanuts, roasted sausages, sweet crispy palm sugars, animals on bamboo sticks, and shaved ice with coconuts or pineapple syrup in paper cones. It felt like a paradise to me. 5 years after we moved to Phnom Penh, it's all changed. We began to see people gathering in the street, carrying their belongings and cooking their meals around the new markets area. Rumors spread that a war was going on in the countryside. My mother stopped a woman and asked what was going on. She told us that they had escaped to the city for safety. One of my classmates, Japanese, was a very talented artist. He drew beautiful cartoon pictures. One day after school, he said, "Siu, come to my house. I have a lot of pictures to show you." I was excited and couldn't wait to see them. The street was very crowded. People riding bicycles, motorbikes, kids out of school, parents picking up their children. Just as we passed by Kim Hong Theater, we heard a loud, muffled explosion. Someone shouted, "Lay down flat to the ground, lay down flat to the ground." People rushed out of the theater screaming and crying, blood dripping all over their bodies. Charlie and I run abandoned bicycles and motorbikes, stumbling over people still lying flat. For months, the explosion kept coming, finally hitting our neighborhood. All the schools had shut down and the streets were empty. One morning, soldiers appeared. Their trucks rolled down our street. I joined friends and neighbors out on the sidewalk, watching them march through our neighborhood. We welcomed them as our heroes. They dressed in black with Khmer towels wrapped around their head or waist, wearing sandals made from tires. I followed my neighbors, raising my hands, clapping and shouting cheerfully to welcome them. Serai Pip, freedom, freedom. Other people cry out in French, La paix, la paix, peace, peace. A few hours later, soldiers started banging on doors, while others shouted through megaphones, "All of you must leave your house right now. The American people are going to drop bombs. Hurry up, leave your house now. You don't need to bring your belongings with you. No need to lock the door. You will come back in 3 days." The whole city was thrown into confusion. People scrambled to collect important items they may need and left their homes in chaos. I heard my neighbors crying, screaming, begging for mercy. My mother called me, "Siu, get your striped shirt and get one for your brother too. Those shirts can protect you from sunburn and mosquito bite." Outside, we joined the thousands of people trudging under the hot sun towards the countryside. People cry and call out their names of their loved ones. Hospital patients were carried on stretchers with the IV hanging on poles. A young mother who obviously had just given birth held her newborn baby tightly against her blood-stained gown. Lost young children scream and cry out for their parents. Elderly people wander the streets in confusion. As night approached, the crying and screaming grew louder. The entire capital was being evacuated overnight. We walked day and night through small villages for several months until we finally reached a village called Pim Cheleng. That night, the Khmer called for a meeting and told us to gather around a bonfire. A soldier shouted, "We have to thank Angkar We have won the war, but we must work harder. There is a lot to be done. Cutting the weed is not enough. It must be pulled up the roots. We have to rebuild our country. If the Khmer Rouge soldiers thought someone's revolutionary spirit was not strong enough, they would say his or her mentality was not stable and polluted. They would come and take that person away. They executed anyone who was intellectual and spoke foreign languages. At the meeting, they shouted, "Keeping one is no gain. Removing one is no loss." After a few months, they moved us again to a new opening in the forest, only a few hours away, called Chetil village. I was so excited. I turned and looked at my grandfather and told him, Grandpa, we are no longer worried about food anymore. We can grow anything." But my heart sank the moment I saw the hut we were assigned to live in. The roof was detached with many broken holes on the bamboo wall. We were surrounded by hundreds of spooky termite hills. The night shadows made us feel like we were sleeping in the middle of a graveyard. Every morning before sunrise, the Khmer Rouge woke us with an alarming sound. Tong, 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 bang, bang, bang. Then they yelled over a megaphone. "You have to work if you want to live. Those who refuse to sacrifice to be crushed by the will of the revolution." They would play the same revolutionary song over loudspeakers repeatedly all day long. We worked constantly, but were not allowed to eat the food we grew. We were told harvested food was for the soldiers in the front line. After a long day of hard labor, we had to attend nightly educational meetings. They told us not to trust anyone in our family and that we must repeat to them anything our parents said or discussed at home. By then, I had learned that talking could get us killed. Someone told me about a cassava field just harvested by the Khmer Rouge. I decided to go there to search for any scraps. There was an old man sitting near the field smoking a cigarette, but they looked like a good person. I asked him politely, "Uncle, may I collect some leftover cassava scrap?" He nodded. He threw the cigarette to the ground and walked away. I cautiously entered the field and was excited to find many whole cassavas left over. This was a treasure to me. I quickly took off my striped shirt and used it for a bag to hold the cassavas I collected. Suddenly, someone behind me shouted, "Thief, stay still, don't run. I'm going to shoot you, stay still." I turned around to find a Khmer Rouge clad in black, holding a rifle charging me. I grabbed the cassava against my belly and started running, zigzagging across the field to avoid being hit by the bullets in case he opened fire. I stumbled over falling branches and fell, spilling the cassava. Bang, bang, bullets zipped past my head. I struggled back up, raced into the dark forest, and hid myself behind a big tree. The sound of footsteps snapping branches grew closer. Bang, 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 bang. Gunshot broke the silence. A moment later, the sound of footsteps receded. Just before dark, I came out of my hiding place and ran toward the village. A Khmer Rouge soldier suddenly emerged from the forest and aimed his rifle at me. I reached my family's hut and ran straight through the back door. I quickly took off my striped shirt and put on a green one. Then I peeked through the bamboo wall and saw the guy coming with his rifle at the ready in his hands. I escaped through the front door. I was too scared to look back. I ran until reaching an area flooded from the recent torrential rains. There, I waited a few hours later until it was completely dark before going back home. When I stepped into the hut, my grandfather looked up and I asked, "Where is everybody, Grandpa?" He said, "The soldier called everyone for an urgent meeting." I rushed to the meeting. There was a crowd gathered around the big flames. My father stood at the center of the crowd next to the fire. My brother Chen, next to him, was tied up with vines. 3 Khmer soldiers crowded near him. One held a rifle. My father dropped to his knee in front of the Khmer commander, pleading for mercy. "Please give my son a chance. I promise he will never steal food again." My mother rushed out from the crowd, fell to her knees next to him at the commander's feet, crying, "Please forgive my son. He's only a child." The whole scene seemed so strange. Finally, I realized that Brother Chan was wearing his striped shirt, just like mine. I thought I escaped danger by changing my shirt, but now I wanted to tell them my brother was innocent. I wanted to turn myself in, explain that the old man had given me the permission to collect cassava from the field. But I was afraid that they might just kill our whole family. So I was so scared and ran back home. When my father got back from the meeting and saw me, he shouted, "You must be the one who stole the cassava," because Chen claimed that he didn't do it. But as soon as I tried to explain, he shouted, "Shut up, I don't want to hear anything." He burst into tears, covered his face with his hand, and sighed, "Oh God, I don't know what to do." That was the only time I saw my father cry. Days later, the Khmer announced everyone had to move to a new location, except my family. The commander told us to wait there until they returned in 14 days. All the refugees slowly marched toward the jungle carrying their few belongings. The Khmer marched alongside them with rifles. As everyone disappeared into the distance, the whole area became deadly quiet. That night, an armed soldier rolled in on a bicycle under the bright moonlight. I thought he was coming to kill us. He called my father's name. "Hung, Hung, Jomao, Jomao, come down, come down." I recognized the voice. It was Uncle Ban. Uncle Ban was my father's childhood friend, who now was a Khmer Rouge. He whispered to my father while drawing a map in the dust to give us direction on how to escape. He said we must leave right away to reach Diamond Village in time to join a group of Vietnamese farmers on their way back to Vietnam. He explained that it was our only last chance to survive. Uncle Ban warned us about landmines planted at the border. He said goodbye and quickly took off. We set off immediately with my father's leading us through the wood. We relied on moonlight to find our way. At Diamond Village, we met the group of farmers and raced through the dense jungle, avoiding landmines as we sped toward the border of Vietnam. Finally, we reached at a point where we could see a Vietnamese flag across the border. My father shouted, "We were here! We were here! We make it!" We all started jumping with joy. Suddenly, 2 men clad in black sprang out of nowhere, pointing rifle at us and shouted, "Give me your gun! Give me your gun! I'm going to shoot you." Those behind us didn't know what was happening. They thought the Khmer Rouge was coming to kill us. They ran and scattered, screaming in terror, trying to escape. Landmine exploded. As some people run this way, others run that way. My father's voice spurred on us. Hurry up, follow me, don't stop. Mines constantly went off. The soil was flying in the air like rain falling upon us. As we cautiously edged closer to the border checkpoint, a small group of Vietnamese soldiers with friendly expressions and outstretched hands approached to welcome us. One of them ordered all families to line up. They could confirm we were Vietnamese. All became deadly quiet, waiting for our turn. My father warned us not to speak because he was the only one who could speak Vietnamese. He told us we would be sent back to Cambodia if we were found out. When he was taken to questioning for the language, my mother was so worried and instructed us to keep praying. To our great relief, he soon returned with an exhausted smile. He told us he passed the language test. My mother beamed with happiness. We were all relieved. One by one, families were allowed to pass through the checkpoint into the land of Vietnam. My mother turned and burst into tears, waving and saying goodbye to Cambodia. She hugged each of us and never looked back.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was incredibly powerful. I've read the book before, but always hearing you speak, it's so much more powerful. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to kind of go on. So Sean described what happened in Cambodia, and I'm going to kind of take it from there to go to what happened once he's actually, I know, working on a second book that will continue on to his resettlement in the US. But in the meantime, let's look at what refugees from Cambodia faced when they came here. So almost every one of them had experienced near death due to starvation, and 90% had a family member or friend murdered. 90%, family member or friend murdered. This, I kind of call it the middle of the story. And that's the part I'm going to tell you here a little bit. Is in my book Exiled, I look at several Cambodian American families who were resettled in the US who are now facing deportation back to Cambodia. And one of them is David right here. This is his family. They were sponsored by a Catholic church, I believe, in somewhere in the Midwest originally. And they were all, his dad didn't survive the killing fields, but his mom and siblings did, and they were all brought to the US. And so he was very young during the killing fields, doesn't remember things quite as clearly as Sean does because he was so young. But we know about PTSD and the long-term biological alterations associated with trauma. His mom had extensive trauma, so did his older siblings. This is David again here. And now we're learning more in recent years, the possibility that the effects of trauma might be passed from parent to offspring through epigenetic mechanisms. So even though David was so young during that time and doesn't even have his own memories, the trauma his family members endured passed through him, not just through their memories and their PTSD, but also through genetics, possibly. And in the story I tell in Exiled, I try to trace not just how this impacts one person when deportation comes about, but how it affects the whole family and community. And I'm going to tell you in a minute how the deportation became possible and such. But we've got here, this is Sati. She was subject to deportation. There's actually, this is one family here, 4 generations. And there's another person here who was also subject to deportation. And quite in a lot of the Cambodian community, many people know at least someone or have a family member or a friend who is facing deportation. And so Sati was a teenager during the killing fields. She survived that with her 2 sisters and her mother there, San. And then here, a number of her children you can see, and then her grandchildren, which are San's great-grandchildren. So we've got 4 generations here. And if Sati is deported, it doesn't only impact her, it impacts her mother, who endured the killing fields. And the Khmer Rouge, as Sean can tell you, were famous for separating families. So that was one thing they did, separate parents from children. And so for San, the idea that she could lose her daughter, even though she's an adult now, once again, scared her, and that she would be sent back to where they endured so much. And then, of course, there's Sati's children and then her grandchildren. So to see just how one case has these ripple effects and goes, and then continues this through the generations. You've got the generation that survived the genocide. Then you have how this trauma passes and continues through with resettlement and then on to deportation. So the deportation, it's actually 25 years this year. The illegal when the act was put in place that made it possible. So the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 expanded the list of deportable offenses and took away some of the power of immigration judges to review and in some cases prevent deportations. Under the new laws, some crimes that do not qualify as felonies under state law were classified as aggravated felonies under immigration law. So when refugees come to the country, they are not automatic citizens. They have to apply for citizenship after they become eligible. They are legal permanent residents as refugees. A lot of countries, you're an automatic citizen, not in the US. And this is where things get complicated and people get in trouble because of this act. If you are not a citizen, you're subjected to laws that citizens don't face and can face deportation. And that is what a lot of those refugees fell into. And the crimes, more than 3/4 of the legal permanent residents deported between 1997 and 2007 had been convicted only of nonviolent crimes. So the majority are nonviolent crimes. Marijuana and cocaine possession and traffic offenses are some of the most common crimes for which people were deported. I know people deported for bad checks, joyriding. A lot of times it was in their youth. They were that middle generation who came very young. They had survived very young the killing fields, and then in resettlement, they were often resettled in areas, depressed areas in the 1980s where there was a lot of violence and did not always have the tools to cope with all of that, and then ran afoul of the law, committed an offense, did their time. All these people did serve time, and it's years later that they're often subject to the deportation after they've gone on, had children, lived a life, done other things. Any drug offense, aside from the conviction of possession of 30 grams or less of marijuana, can result in the deportation of a legal permanent resident. And a lot of these people were not aware of this. Legal permanent resident, it sounds like it's permanent. And until this started actually happening, people didn't know that this was a risk. The numbers. Over 17,000 Southeast Asian Americans have received final orders of removal. More than 2,000 Southeast Asian Americans have been deported. Deportations of Cambodian Americans have increased drastically in recent years. Between 2017 and 2018, there was a 279% increase in deportations of Cambodian Americans and an over 50% increase in deportation of Vietnamese Americans. Before Trump, it gets really complicated when you look into the laws and everything, but there was a memorandum of understanding that Vietnamese Americans who came before a certain year would not be deported, but in recent years, that has not been, I don't know if acknowledged is the right word. Anyhow, Vietnamese Americans are also facing deportation, where even if they came before a certain year, and that was not happening before. So in my book, Exiled, I tell the story of 4 families who survived the killing fields and then are facing deportation in the US, and then look at what happens when some have been deported and go back to Cambodia, which for most of them as a country, they don't know, because many of these were younger than Sean when they left, maybe 4 or 5, and have very little memories. They identify as Americans. So I'm just going to read a short passage from the book called The Diplomat and the Deportee. They were all youngish, in their 30s and 40s, and all men, all people he used to know. They didn't tell him their crimes, and he didn't ask. All they told him was that they were on the list to be deported to Cambodia. Then they asked for his help. They sought him out because he used to be like them, a tough, streetwise bad boy. But now he had his own picture framing business next to a nail salon and a cluster of other small shops on a busy corner in Long Beach, California. Inside the one-story brick building, he was surrounded by a history different from his own in hundreds of historical photos of Long Beach. They were quaint black and white beach scenes from the previous century, including one of a smartly dressed fire chief and his staff headed to work in an early automobile. It wasn't the Long Beach Champaran Menoweth Min knew, but it was the Long Beach he sold. Then there were the custom framing jobs he did, abstract paintings, athletic jerseys, American flags. This was his life now. The men who came in off the street asking for help did not belong in it. But it hadn't been that long since Champaran had been a part of their world. Like them, he had been a convicted non-citizen felon on the list to be deported. That was in 2003, early on, just after the deportations became a reality. Only Champaran had been allowed to stay. They wanted to know how. He told them the first thing that came to mind. Get down on your knees and pray. He remembers telling them to pray a lot and to try not to get in any more trouble. Become a good person. Do what I did, and just maybe there will be a miracle. If you are lucky, it will work out at the very last minute, as it did for me, and you won't be deported to a land you haven't known for decades, a land your families fled, often before you were old enough to remember. He never saw them again. They vanished, swallowed by the streets from which they had emerged. That was a decade ago. They don't come anymore. Maybe they are okay. Maybe they are in trouble again. Champaran doesn't know. He doesn't want to. He has a wife and son now. In early 2015, he is 56, although he looks younger, is still trim and fit, and is dressed stylishly, but not outlandishly. He has black tortoiseshell glasses and wears tight t-shirts that reveal his flesh has yet to soften and sag. He has a thick accent, but not so thick that he can't be understood. Photo of his wife and son decorate his office. One wrong move and he could lose it all. The wife he met on the internet, the 4-year-old son he plays Power Rangers with, the framing shop he used to work at and now owns. If he gets in trouble with the law, he could be deported to the country he fled decades ago. In his nightmares, he sees it vividly. Cambodia. Sometimes he's in the jungle. Sometimes there's a firing squad with soldiers. Sometimes he's in the city. In the last scene, he is wandering, trying to find his family. Not his wife and son, but the family he lost after he came to the United States in 1975, just months before the country fell to the Khmer Rouge. His mother, his father, and his 4 sisters. The family who had been leaders in the previous US-backed government, which was overthrown when the communist Khmer Rouge took control. The family who had sent him to Washington, D.C., promising they would be right behind him. They weren't. Other Cambodians came, refugees of the regime under which almost a quarter of the country's population died. The refugees sought Champaran out, wanting him to know his family's fate. They wanted him to know they were really sorry. They told him his uncle Lon Non, not to be confused with Lon Nol, had been beheaded and his parents slaughtered. They didn't say anything about his sisters, the older one or the 3 younger ones. They didn't have to. He knew they were dead. A family such as his did not survive the Khmer Rouge. He was alive only because they had sent him away. He was 19. His past had been erased. His future was empty. Too timid to kill himself, but lacking the will to live, he got into drugs, marijuana, cocaine, speed, quaaludes. He did time for reckless driving, driving under the influence, and selling drugs. In 2001, he was convicted of trying to defraud Medi-Cal, the California Medical Assistance Program, by selling blood and stolen medical identification cards, and was ordered to pay $25,000 in restitution and to spend 16 months in prison. 2 years later, he was on the list of convicted US legal permanent resident Cambodian felons to be deported to Cambodia. I'm gonna leave that there. So that is just one story of one Cambodian, but this is much larger than that. And that's what I wanna show you right now with the movie Blue Bayou that just came out this month, is actually talking about Korean adoptees who, another war again, the Korean War, are facing deportation. And so like refugees, foreign adoptees were not automatic citizens. And so until the Child Citizenship Act of 2000 allowed adoptees under 18 at the time of the act to get automatic US citizenship. But those born prior to 1983 had to apply for citizenship, something their parents and the organizations they were adopted through sometimes failed to carry out. And so this movie actually chronicles the story of a Korean American adoptee facing deportation. He has a family here in the US, and then this comes up years later after, again, he had already done time for a crime. And 112,000 is the approximate number of Korean children adopted in the US in the last 60 years. Around 20% are not citizens. So I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand, is how many people are impacted by those laws that were put in place 25 years ago, and how many of them came to this country as refugees, and how the relevance now is we're looking at more refugees coming in, and how we help them or don't help them can impact what happens next in their stories. And with that, I wanted to move on so we can kind of have a discussion to talk more about refugees, resettlement, writing, and genocide. We started this talk with the genocide in Cambodia, and we're here in California, and there's genocide here as well. And that is something that Robert McNally wrote about in the Modoc War. It's the general nonfiction finalist in the 2018 Northern California Book Awards. Also won a gold medal for the Commonwealth Club of California as the year's best book on California. And he is going to moderate our talk now. So I am going to pass it over to Robert.
And here we are. Okay. Thank you, Katya. And thank you, Sean. I want to just say one thing that got me, how I connected with Katya originally, even and then further with Sean on this, is we Americans typically have a way of thinking of genocide as something that happens elsewhere. It happens a long way off. It happens in Europe under the Holocaust. It happens in Cambodia. It happens in Southwest Africa in the early 19th century, early 20th century. But the truth is, genocide happened in California, and it's something that's been kept in the closet until the last few years. And that really had to do with a state-financed, state-sponsored campaign to exterminate the native peoples of California that went on particularly from 1851 to 1873, but actually continued in its effects until 1900. And in that process, there were originally about 150,000 California native people when it became an American territory. And by the end of the 19th century, there were only 15,000 left. So in other words, the native population had been killed down by 90%. And even though that has been admitted to some extent now by Gavin Newsom and is some beginning towards reconciliation, we are all also living with the effects of that particular genocide. And so the story we're hearing here about Cambodian refugees and also about Cambodians who suffered through the killing fields is a story that's been repeated over and over, including right here in our home state. And so this is not something that happens off in the corner or you can choose to notice it or not. Genocide is a all too human phenomenon. And it's something we have trouble dealing with. And I want to start off with asking Katya a question to begin, because I think there's this real powerful issue about, as writers, how do you find the right place to write from? And what I mean in that is that you talk in your preface about the way that you're connected to the story of deported Cambodian refugees because there was intergenerational trauma inside your own family. You had a Cambodian American friend named Avery who got you interested in this. And you notice when you began researching the story that these young Cambodian American women spoke the same West Coast slang you knew from high school. So there was this personal connection. But you also say, there's one time you describe yourself when you're in a waiting room for an immigration court hearing, and you describe yourself as, quote, tall and white, one of only 3 white people in the room. And I think that's a fascinating thing where you're both personally connected to the story and standing outside of it. And I'm really curious to know how, as a writer and reporter, you found the right point of view, the right perspective from which you could write this book and be true to it.
I think it's a really hard, and I hope I did find that right place. I think having been a journalist all my adult life helps. I'm used to being the outsider, but I'm also used to being welcome to hear people's stories. It's just kind of the role I've had, is someone who listens and tells stories. And I think, and of course it isn't possible if people don't trust me with their stories. And I always think that is a great honor they give me when they do trust me to tell their stories. And usually it takes quite a bit of time to earn that trust. And to do that, I try and show them what I do have in common with them, while acknowledging I have no idea what they have faced. I can have no idea. I can say sympathy or feel for them, but I cannot know what any one person has faced in their life. So I just listen and rely on them to tell me. But at the same time, so getting to seeing what we have in common, but also acknowledging the differences too, and not trying to be one of them. I think it's important to have stories told from the inside and from the outside. I think it's really good. That's why Sean and I like teaming up so much, is because he has the story. He was there. He can tell his personal story, whereas I'm an outsider who can step back and put the context of this bigger aspects that are going on, and also show for an audience, American who don't know this history, kind of put it in perspective a bit. As a journalist, I feel it's kind of my job to try and put things in perspective. And I think, though, you need a number of different types of people telling stories. They can't be told by just one thing. I think my story is incomplete if you don't have Sean's story too. And both those stories are probably incomplete if you don't have other aspects. I think we need stories from multiple perspectives. And I think I kind of took your question and took it in a totally different way. But that was kind of, I think, it is interesting, though. I like to balance, I think everywhere I go, I've reported from a lot of different countries, even within the US, different communities. And so I always try and find the commonalities, the things most people care about, their families, they care about having shelter, food. So I'll try and find that with people, but then I'll just sit and listen and tell me what it's like, because I have no idea, and just try and do that and hope it works.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because I think you're right. You're trying to balance this inside-outside thing and the trust of the story. And Sean, in reading your book, which I realize is the first direct account I've ever read by a Cambodian about what it was like to be in the killing fields. And so it was really quite revelatory to me. And something that really, really leapt out at me was that, even despite all the horrors that you went through, your family remained connected and supportive of each other, no matter how bad the circumstances were. I mean, I have read stories of this kind of horror where families just shatter. And your family did not. And you wrote in the book, quote, "Our elders taught us well that we need to survive not just alone, but together." And I would love it if you would tell us more about how Cambodian culture and religious teaching helped you endure the genocide.
Thank you, Bob. I would say that in Cambodian culture, traditionally, it is a common practice for men to become monks and live in the monastery for a short period of time. And these things usually would stay a few weeks or a few months to learn the regulated lifestyle of being Buddhist and pay respect to the monk, and to bring honor and merit to their parents, and also to get connected to their Buddhist faith, and to also learn avoid doing bad things and learn to be generous, open-minded, and respectful to all living things, especially toward our elders. And usually they start at the age of 13. And I remember when I was 10 years old, my parents were already planning to send me and my brothers to live at the monastery. And I was very excited about that because when I was a child, I was so into the Buddhist scriptures. And when I was brought by my grandmas to the temples to offer food to the monks, and that was quite excited me to wait for that opportunity. And when I was a child, I was very fortunate to be surrounded by loving parents and grandparents. And I learned to develop a strong bond and remain connected and be supportive of one another in the family during those terrible circumstances. And my mother was a devout Buddhist. She's always talking to my grandmother. They both discuss about how to help us to build our future, to be a good person. And I remember my mother always said, children grow just like a bamboo. They must be bent while they are young. So that's how I was taught from them, how in the family, how to be connected with our loved one.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, is that kind of deep cultural teaching gave you the strength to go through this whole experience and to retain those connections, which can be so readily shattered by this kind of tragedy, this kind of horror. I want to ask another question now back at Katya, which I found very disturbing in reading your book, which is that the United States Immigration Service has a real problem with seeing Cambodian refugees as people. For example, the Immigration Service considers David Ross, who is one of the folks you've taught. In fact, I think that was his picture earlier as a little teeny boy, who was a darling little guy, that he was a felon and he did hard time for second-degree murder. And they don't see him as the father of little Solomon, his son, and the main support of his family. And then there's Tooch, also a one-time convict, and he was trying to remain in the country long enough to arrange for a kidney transplant for his ailing brother. And if he didn't get that transplant, that brother would die. And what you also write in the book that this country took in the refugees who came out of Cambodia and then parked them in ghettos and housing projects and left them on their own without support. And so I'm curious to what extent US policy helped create this sort of dehumanization that just makes the refugee issue or the issues facing these refugees that much worse.
Yeah, and I think it was unintentional. I don't think, I think like so many things, policies and such, we just don't understand. We're like, we're going to take in these refugees, but we weren't necessarily prepared. It was the Refugee Act that actually went into place with in 1980 with the influx of Southeast Asian American refugees. And so I don't think we understood the kind of trauma and the different culture people were coming from enough to help them. And so I don't think it was intentional at all, but I do think it is something we need to learn from. For example, San and her three daughters, her daughters were teenagers under the Khmer Rouge, and they came to the US, were resettled. San didn't speak any English at all. And at the time, there weren't a lot of people who spoke Khmer to help them out with resettlement or anything. And so she got a job somewhere where she didn't have to speak a lot of English. And at one point, her oldest daughter, Sati, kept getting in abusive relationships. And they talked about, I asked at one point, well, and people would ask them, why didn't you call the cops? And they said, well, why would you call the cops? Because under the Khmer Rouge, you're not going to call the authorities, because the authorities are the ones who you're scared of, because they're the ones who are beating people up and killing people. And so it was that lack of understanding we had. And at one point later, Sati tries to kill herself, and someone finds her and puts her in a mental institution. And the police come to San to tell her where her daughter is. And San doesn't know what they're telling her. She doesn't understand. So they write it down. And it's not till the next day at work that San has someone who can read the English for her and tell her where her daughter is. And so there's these huge, again, I don't know that blame needs to be placed necessarily or anything. It's just lack of knowledge of those things. But now that we know what is needed, I think we are better these days at trying to acknowledge trauma for sure and help with these things. But I think there was more early on, just kind of throw people out there and expect them to be okay. And I think also the acts in 25 years ago that enabled the deportations were a bit short-sighted in some ways, because they don't acknowledge that, well, these people, they may not be full Americans because they're legal permanent residents, but at this point, their children are Americans. They are part of the community. So you're not really solving anything by sending them away, because they are still immersed. They are very American. Their families are American. And you're just continuing this. So I think a lot of times maybe it's just short-sighted policies where we haven't thought deeper about what more is needed in these situations. And I think it's so important now, especially if we have people coming from Afghanistan, a very different culture, again, a lot of trauma again, that we understand what could be done, what needs to be done to help ensure that this doesn't continue.
Okay. Yeah, I think, yeah, it's interesting. What you're really kind of saying to me is there's a kind of institutional error, ignorance. In other words, they really don't understand the culture. And I can see where this sort of situation could get readily repeated, particularly with people coming from Afghanistan, which is just a terribly different place from here. And I can see the same kind of function of just simply, not willful evil, but just plain bungling ignorance about who these people are, what they need, what kind of language help, support services, and so forth. And I wouldn't be surprised if we unfortunately see a repeat of some of the things that went on with Cambodians. I mean, that's anyway, which is, but maybe we can make it better. I mean, I would hope also that there's been some learning, institutional learning, and that we didn't do this one very well. Maybe we can do this new one better. And let's hope that that's the case. I want to ask, I've got another question for Sean. I would like to take back to him about this very direct issues around what living in Cambodia was like, and how it, in a curious way, almost gave you the foundation, allowed you to get through the genocide. And you talk a lot about the power of stories, particularly those told by your mother and your grandmother. And I have noticed that many of them underscore that very central Buddhist precept of kindness to every creature and striving to free all beings from suffering. And I am again curious about how this received wisdom that came right down through your ancestors actually worked to give you strength to go through all this horror of everything from starvation to wandering across the country, not knowing where you were going. So if anything you can tell us to enlighten us about that kind of, as I called it, received wisdom from your mother and grandmother, and how that helped you.
I think when I was young, my grandmother and my mother shared many folk tales and cautionary tales. They were based on the real life stories, which gave me wisdom and strong moral compass. Because of the Buddhist precepts of kindness, which I have cultivated from my early childhood, which helped me to identify good things and bad things, and try to be as good as I could in any decision I make. And I have a folktale story that I would like to share with you. Is that one of the folktales that really embedded in my life is that one of the particular scary tale I love the most is called The Goddess of the Earth. The story was about an old lady who lived with her adult son in a rural area. And she was frail and unsteady, but she had to do house chores and prepare meals for her son every day while he was busy spending much of his time patronizing cockfights. Every time when his bird lost the bottle, he would return home and get upset and start cursing his mother and smashing things in the house. One gusty morning, the son brusquely appeared in front of her. Mother, I need you to watch my rooster carefully. I keep it in a bamboo cage behind the hut. I am going out to grab some rice wine and will be right back. As the old lady began to wring out her clothes and place them on a bamboo pole to dry her clothes, a high wind suddenly blew the heavy post off the hook. It landed right on top of the bamboo cage and wounded the rooster. The old lady panicked and immediately picked up the half-dead creature, cradled it in her arms, but the rooster died eventually. When her son returned to find the bird lying dead in her mother's hand, "Mother, what did you do to my precious pet?" He shouted and took a scythe from the wall and grabbed a handful of her hair. "My son, please don't hurt your mother." The old lady screamed and pleaded. "You are so old and useless. You can't even take care of the small things I asked you to do." He violently dragged her across the backyard toward the open ground. "I have to get rid of you," he barked hysterically. He raised the scythe up in the air and was about to slash her. Suddenly, a powerful mass of winds rose up from underneath the ground. The goddess of the earth became visible. She held her long hair with her hands and pointed toward the ground. The earth slowly began to shake and crack, splitting open up a giant fissure. The elderly mother was stunned. She stepped back and watched her son become fearful. "Mother, please help me," he screamed for mercy. But the powerful wind swallowed him and plunged him into a dark hole and disappeared. So these profound folk tales really impact my life and taught me to appreciate living world and never do anything go against the law of the mother nature. This is how I learned from the folk tales of my grandmother, taught me how to respect the elderly in the family or the elderly in our societies. And in the story of A Cloak of Good Fortune, I also talk about the brutality, hard labor, torture, and death. But most importantly, it's about staying focused and always trying to do the right things, no matter how hard and how difficult life is. And in one of the chapters, I also talk about the Khmer Rouge labor camp, while a group of us were cleaning up the forest. An elderly man was begging me for food, and I was having only so little food for myself because he was so starving. And he said to me that he didn't want to die and became a starving ghost. After sharing my meager meal with him, suddenly he became so furious and he looked at us and I was terrified. I don't know what happened. And he said, "These Khmer Rouge soldiers are just a small group of people. Why don't we all grab their weapons and beat them to death so everyone will be free from suffering? And I was so terrified when I heard what he said, and I was totally confused and wondered, would violence be the only solution?
Yeah, that's an interesting. How does one resolve that issue around violence as a response to violence? That is a really critical question. And I want to wrap up with, I've got a question for the both of you. And it's a reference to a statement I heard made by, I didn't hear Joseph Stalin make it, but he is said to have said that one murder is a crime, but 1 million murders is simply a statistic. And one of the things that's so overwhelming about the Cambodian genocide, and even the refugee numbers that Katya cites, is that there are so many. And as I understand it, the Cambodian genocide killed between 2 and 2.5 million people, about 30% of the entire country. And somehow we start losing an understanding of what that means because the numbers are so big and they're so far outside our comprehension. So but what you guys, both of you do in your books is to tell very specific individual stories so that this great mass of suffering and killing and so forth becomes very individual. And I'm kind of curious what you think you're hoping that does for your readers. What kinds of lessons can they take from these stories that you tell and extend it into the horrors we even see in our own time so that they have a better grasp? I mean, for example, with all these Haitian refugees that were crowded under that bridge in Del Rio, Texas. How does what you have written about help us better understand what kind of position those people are in? And you can answer whichever one of you wants to go first. Okay.
I'll go if that's okay, Sean.
Okay, yes.
I think empathy is a big thing in understanding. I think when you hear about deportations and you just hear a felon is being deported, then you think, oh, who cares, but then when you realize that's David Ross, who is a murderer, but also is actually a really good father to a little boy, Solomon, who's 5 years old, who then is going to grow up without a father, just as David grew up without a father in Cambodia because his father was killed by the Khmer Rouge. So I think it's putting a face on that, like you said, but also humanizing it and then understanding what caused, maybe you don't have sympathy because you think it's a felon, but then realizing it's a bigger story than that. It's not, a person is not just one single thing, there are many things. And that when you see that person as a father, then you relate to them because most people have a father or are a father or something like that. So finding those things that people understand and can relate to and then can empathize with and see themselves in that picture, because I think, I hate to say Stalin was right about anything, but I do agree with that statement that when you've just got the statistic, it's mind-numbing. We can push it aside, but when it's a person, it's someone when there's a name, when there's a face, when there's a story, then we care. And that's, I think, what writers and journalists are always doing, is trying to make people care and have them understand and see that.
Sean, do you have a take on it?
I think the story like Holocaust and Cambodian genocide must be told over and over again so that the world will not forget. And we can only hope it helps reduce the chance of it happening again. And I think to answer the question you asked, Bob, like Katya mentioned, it is important for everyone to channel empathy and compassion for the humanitarian crisis for all refugees faced at every border. No one wants to be refugees. Things happen. What happens to others may someday happen to us. There is urgency in storytelling here. We must ask ourselves, what are the refugee stories? What have they lost? What have they given up and endured seeking peace and safety in an unknown land.
I think that's really, I mean, you're right there. Is how do we understand these people not as a crowd, just a statistic, a large number, but individual people with their own stories who really don't want to be in this situation. I'm going to switch over now to some questions that have been coming out of the audience. And this first one is actually has a certain commonality with the question that you both just answered. And it goes like this. It's so hard for many Americans to imagine living through something as treacherous as what Sean describes in his story. And I feel like that's why there are some who don't empathize with the refugee plight. How can we as individuals help to do our part to bring light to those suffering in similar situations? I think what positive things can Americans watching this occur do to somehow alleviate the suffering of refugees and to just simply that alleviate the suffering of refugees? Sean, why don't you start that one off? Because that's right to where you were talking. So.
I think, many refugees went through war and suffering horrific traumas in their life, and they really need support. But hearing the deportation is not going to help them. It's not going to support their family, and living in the situation that there's no support. It is so unbelievable how they have to re-traumatize themselves again. And I remember on one occasion when I was serving as a medical interpreter at the refugee clinic at San Francisco General Hospital, I was assisting Dr. Judith Shepherd with interpretation for a female Cambodian support group meeting. And that was a beautiful clinic that they provide a lot of service at the time to support all the refugees who needs help when they were traumatized by war. And a woman in her early 40s rushed up to me and grabbed my hands, and she kneeled and burst in tears and said, "Young brother, do you remember me?" I looked at her in her eyes and I thought she went crazy. And then she said, "You are the one who saved my life in the refugee camp. And when I was raped, you report the incident to the Red Cross. And I was so grateful for that. But how could you live your life so normal? And I could not sleep at night. These things keep coming back to me." And it took me a second to realize that we both used to live in the same refugee camp. I did not know what to say and what to do. And I just gave her a smile and trying to comfort her, to calm her down. And then finally, I said to her, "Listen, if I can do it, you can do it. We are all damaged, but we are not destroyed." The woman nodded at me and smiled. And I think to have that support group meeting, it's so powerful to help them to put their life back together. That's how I look in the system. I hope that our government continue to support refugees who were traumatized by war, and they have to really take this seriously as well, not just only to have them to come to the country and then believing that they can do their own to survive.
Katya, would you like to add to that? Yeah.
Yeah, there's actually Touch, one of the people you mentioned earlier who I follow in the story. He came quite young child to the US and then ended up getting in trouble with the law and facing deportation. But when I kept talking to his family and asking him, when did it change? What was his childhood like? They cited a couple things, but one thing they said was he had this mentor, this American man who served as a mentor for Touch. And after that man died and was no longer in his life, they noticed that Touch started getting in more trouble. So individuals can make a difference, and people who are there and just reach out and listen and show they care. And I think that's nice to know, because there's policy, and oftentimes policy also often does fall short. but individuals can make a difference and can try, and just by being there, listening, mentoring. I think so many of the families at that time didn't understand how the US system worked. And so if they had one person who just came in and explained how it works to apply for citizenship, how it works to apply for jobs, how it works to apply for benefits, all these things, it would help them immensely. And so I'm a big believer in kind of just individuals trying to help as well.
You know, I'm curious, Kai, are you aware of ways that people can do that on their own now?
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend in Kentucky, resettles a lot in Louisville, Kentucky, and they resettle a lot of refugees. And there's their Kentucky Refugee Ministries. I remember I was there last time, and her husband just kind of gone through Kentucky Refugees Ministries, hooked up with a family that had come from, I'm trying to remember where they were from. Congo maybe, and he kept going over there. He was changing a lot of bike tires because the kids kept getting flat tires, and finally he just taught them how to change their own bike tires. But usually they're organizations like that. I have another friend, actually, family friend, who tutors a Cambodian woman, I think, in English. And so I guess it depends where you're located, but there are usually organizations that help refugees. And if you reach out to them, they can usually tell you how you could help with tutoring, with just kind of looking in on a family, with providing services, with all those kind of things. So it'll depend where you live, who helps, but there's usually an organization that will help. Catholic Charities is a big one. And I'm trying to think, yeah, it just depends your location.
Okay. All right. I've still got a couple more questions coming out of the audience that I think are both rather fascinating. The first one is there any legislation currently in the works to help Cambodian and Vietnamese refugees currently living in the United States?
So there was, oh, sorry.
No problem, go ahead.
There was one that was to try and kind of, it didn't go very far, unfortunately, but there was one to kind of address the earlier laws. It's hard once an act is in place, though, to get rid of it. That's one of the problems. But there was a big campaign around when I was writing Exiled a couple of years ago to really try and change these, then also to bring some home. Now, there is now, Biden has done deported. He's trying to bring back more. Before Biden, it was very, very rare that you could bring back someone who was deported. And now there is more of a chance of that, especially for people who served in the US military. He is really trying to do that. And there is more hope that former refugees like Cambodian Americans could be brought back as well. And a few have been brought back. But there's also, as far as legislation, the best place to follow up on that is actually, I'm going to put a link in chat. CRAC, oh wait, I need to put it to everyone. Is an organization that really is on top of that. And I actually have kind of a campaign going right now to raise more awareness, because it is 25 years since that act initially passed, and they have videos and things like that. And they can also tell you things you can sign if you're interested in trying to change things. But right now, I don't think any law is exactly on the books. There have been ones in past that haven't made it through, and they're continually trying to get attention to it. So that's the best place to go to follow up on that.
Okay. Sean, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think mostly Katya covered for that already.
Okay.
And I just want to share something. I remember one of my Cambodian fellow just shared with me the other day. She said that as a survivor like us, when people live through such an atrocity like us, we might have only two choices: becoming stronger emotionally, yet being ever so gentle and compassionate, for we know how horrific emotional pain inflicted on us. And the other option is to break down and become hateful and angry and pass down the harm on ourselves and toward other people in our life, especially our children. So that's how I see that, having support group or providing any agency that can help support refugees is a good way to look into that as well.
And our last question here is one it's a nice big one that writers just love. It says, as writers, what's the main theme or lesson you want your readers to take away from your work? I imagine there are multiple. So, this is something we could talk about for about the next 3 days. But Sean, I'm just trying to, since you're up on screen, kind of briefly, what really is, like, in 25 words or less, what is the kind of main learning lesson, principle that you would like people to walk away from your book with?
I want to let people know that the war in Cambodia is not just like a lunch or dinner. It's a scar that carried forever for the rest of people's life. And I want the world to know that this thing is not dying. We want to keep it alive, to let people know that this atrocity will not relapse again.
And Katya, what is it you would really like readers to walk away from your book with?
I think in some ways it kind of parallels Sean's in a different way, though. I think for me, the big thing was the generational, that it's not a one-time thing, the larger impact, again, of how, whether it's deportations or the genocide, but how it doesn't just affect one person or the survivors. It affects whole families, whole communities. It affects not just Cambodia, it affects the US. It's kind of a broader thing. I think sometimes we try and isolate and separate and say that, well, that happened there, that's their problem, that's that, but it impacts all of us. It really does, because then I went to school with a Cambodian refugee. And so it's our community. It's not those people or that country. It's all of us. I think that's really what I hope people get. One of the things I hope they get.
I think I had a similar issue in writing the Modoc War, which was that I really wanted people to know that the story of the West was not John Wayne, and that it was a much deeper and nastier tale of conquest and extermination and dispossession, and that it happened here too. Not on the same scale as Cambodia by any means, except that if you look at the percentages, they're really pretty terrible in terms of the number of native peoples who were killed off. And it's a scar. It's just like Sean said, this is a scar, and we continue to live with it. And also, like you just said, Katya, it's part of the whole community. Native Americans are Americans. Cambodian Americans are Americans. I mean, we're all in this together, and it's something we need to deal with together. And with that will wrap up the audience Q&A, and I can pass it back to Jeff to finish this up.
All right, thank you guys so much. Thank you for coming out tonight and joining us for this. And I really appreciate and want to thank the panelists for taking the time and sharing their stories and sharing their perspectives. It's a really important discussion to have, and I'm really happy that we were able to do this tonight. And thank you all for coming, and thank you all for your questions. And we really hope to do this kind of thing again. And hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you.